Welcome to Thenot, fresh and authenticist of the Sleepless Historian, where we unravel the epic tales of history's greatest civilizations. Today, we dive into the rise and fall of Assyria, the world's first true empire, a powerhouse of innovation, conquest, and ruthless ambition that shaped the ancient world from their awe-inspiring cities to their brutal military campaigns. We'll explore how Assyria carved out a legacy that echoes through time. Join us as we uncover the triumphs, tragedies, and untold stories of this Mesopotamian giant in a journey that promises to keep you sleepless with fascination. If you're as captivated by history's hidden chapters as we are, please show your support by liking, subscribing, and hitting that notification bell so you don't miss a single episode of Sleepless Historian. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're tuning in from, what time it is at your end, and what historic topic you'd love us to explore next. Your engagement fuels our passion for bringing these stories to life. So let's build this community of sleepless history lovers together. Tell us what's keeping you up tonight. Now let's begin the story. Before we step into the ancient world, take a moment to get comfortable. Dim your lights, find a cozy spot, and let the worries of the day slip away. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and imagine yourself standing on the sun-baked plains of Mesopotamia, where the winds carry whispers of long-forgotten empires. Let the rhythm of history pull you in as we journey back in time together to lose yourself in the saga of Assyria. Here we go. The defenders posted in the outer entrance of the Shemesh Gate in the southeastern corner of Nineveh were fighting desperately, while Babylonian and Median soldiers showered them with arrows. They knew full well that if their efforts to repel their opponents failed, they would not survive. During the previous months, work crews had frantically tried to narrow the gates of Nineveh by haphazardly extending their side walls with poorly dressed stone blocks. The Assyrian kings, most notably Sennacherib, who not that long ago had turned Nineveh into the greatest city of its time, had wanted the city gates to be monumental and beautiful. Even in their wildest dreams, they would never have imagined that the generous proportions of the entranceways might one day prove a strategic liability. But now, in the heat of the summer of 612 BCE, it turned out that this was exactly the problem. The size of the gates and the enormous length of the city wall made it impossible to defend Nineveh effectively. And then, on a fateful day in August, after a 3-month-long siege, the enemy finally broke through. The Babylonian and Median troops and their allies swarmed into the city to do what the Assyrians had done so many times to others. They engaged in an orgy of slaughter, pillage, and destruction. Nineveh's palaces, temples, and private residences went up in flames. The Assyrian soldiers stationed in the Shemesh Gate, along with a number of citizens who had tried to escape through the gate at the very last minute, were dead at this point, victims of the enemy attack that had resulted in Nineveh's conquest. Hit by arrows or killed by other means, their bodies were strewn on the ground in outflung or contorted positions, some face downward, others looking as if they had expired in a running pose, and no one was left to pick them up and bury them. The skeletons of the fallen remained where they lay for some 2,600 years, along with the arrowheads that had pierced their bodies, and the stone blocks hastily moved into the outer entrance as a lost barrier against the advancing enemy. They were still in situ when a team from the University of California at Berkeley excavated Shemesh Gate in 1989 and 1990, removed the rubble that covered the scene, and began to reconstruct the story behind it. The conquest of Nineveh, which led to the death of the soldiers and civilians struck down in the Shemesh Gate, and tens of thousands of other people, is a key episode in the dramatic narrative of the Assyrian Empire's collapse. Assyria's fall was a sudden one, playing out over just a few years. It was an event rather than a process, and thus very different from the slow decline of the Roman Empire, a state that otherwise had so much in common with Assyria. The French Assyriologist Paul Garelli has called it a historical scandal, and modern historians are indeed hard-pressed to explain how it was possible that a state as large, wealthy and powerful as ancient Assyria, with a dynasty that had been in place for more than 1,000 years, could disappear so suddenly and completely. But what happened did not come entirely out of the blue. Several long-term trends had contributed to it. The sources available for the last 20 years of the Assyrian Empire are somewhat different from those extant from other periods of Assyrian history. Assyrian royal inscriptions, while not entirely absent, are of little help, as Assyrian kings did not write about setbacks and humiliations. The inscriptions of the Babylonian kings are not particularly informative either, albeit for a different reason. In keeping with an age-old tradition of Babylonian rulers focusing on their relationship with the gods, on sacrifices and temple building, rather than their military activities, Nabopolassar and Nebuchadnezzar II, who played decisive roles in the defeat of Assyria, said little about their great triumph over their northern neighbor. Nabopolassar claimed that he overthrew the Sabarian, that is, Assyria, and turned his lands into tells and desolate places, using the weapon of the awe-inspiring warrior god Era, who strikes my enemies with lightning. But he added no further details. Other texts are more revealing. Legal and economic documents from Babylonia, and to a lesser extent from Assyria, have helped scholars reconstruct the chronology of events and clarify when some of the different cities of Babylonia changed sides as the conflict progressed. A key source is the Babylonian Chronicle series. After a lacuna for the years 622 to 617, it picks up in 616 BCE and provides detailed information on the havoc the Babylonian and Median troops wrought in the Assyrian heartland from then on, as well as the last tragic convulsions of the Assyrian state and the role the Egyptians played during those fateful years. Two recently published letters from the Assyrian northwest cast new light on the situation shortly after the conquest of Nineveh. Some historical literary texts known from cuneiform tablets from the Seleucid period, including the so-called Nabopolassar epic, are likewise of interest, even though it remains uncertain to what extent they accurately reflect what had happened in the late 7th century, some 300 years before they were written. The same applies to the Hebrew Bible, most notably the Book of Nahum, and to Greek sources such as the accounts of Berossus and Ctesias. These sources contain many inaccuracies, but also include some intriguing details that seem to be taken from first-hand accounts. Finally, there is considerable archaeological evidence, not only at Nineveh but also at Arsha, Kala, Durakaplimu, and elsewhere. Together, these sources paint a portrait of an empire in its death throes, unable to withstand the onslaught of a series of major challenges. As pointed out earlier, almost nothing is known about the last years of Ashurnasirpal's reign. From the early 630s onward, his royal inscriptions no longer talk about military exploits. At first glance, the political situation seems to have been calm during this period. Elam was substantially weakened, Babylonia was quiet, and Tabal and Urartu, Assyria's old enemies in eastern Anatolia, were in dire straits. But there are also signs that Assyria was in considerable trouble. Archaeological evidence, and the testimony of the Greek historian Herodotus, suggest that the empire's hegemony over the eastern Mediterranean and parts of the Levant had come to an end shortly after 640, perhaps as a consequence of Scythian raids. Egyptian troops eventually filled the void. At the same time, Assyria seems to have experienced some internal economic hardship caused by poor harvests. In 631, after a reign of nearly 40 years, Ashurnasirpal passed away. He may have died from old age, although there is no definitive evidence to shed light on the circumstances of his end. He was succeeded by his young son Ashur-etil-ilani, who ruled from about 630 to 627, but Ashur-etil-ilani turned out to be little more than a figurehead, the puppet of a powerful unit by the name of Sin-Shru-mu-lishir. The preamble of a grant made in Ashur-etil-ilani's name leaves no doubt about his dependent status. After my father and begetter, Ashurnasirpal, had departed, no father brought me up or taught me to spread my wings. No mother cared for me or saw to my education. Sin-Shru-mu-lishir, however, the chief eunuch, one who had deserved well of my father and begetter and had constantly guided me like a father, installed me safely on the throne, and made the people of Assyria keep watch over my kingship while I was a minor. These are the words of a king who was clearly not in charge. And his weakness did not go unobserved. As the same preamble reveals, Ashurnasirpal's accession to the throne was soon followed by an inner Assyrian rebellion led by a certain Narrated. It was eventually quelled, but only through the good services of Ashurnasirpal. Then, in 627, Ashurnasirpal disappeared from the scene. Since he was still very young at this point, he was quite possibly murdered. At about the same time, Tiglath-Pileser, the Assyrian puppet installed as king of Babylonia, also passed away. The implications of these two royal deaths were enormous. They led to political chaos, both in Assyria and Babylonia, and then to the protracted war that would end with the fall of Assyria. The Babylonian Akitu Chronicle puts it well. After the death of Tiglath-Pileser, troubles took place in Assyria and Akkad, i.e. Babylonia. A permanent state of hostility ensued, and there was a long succession of battles. Even before Ashurnasirpal's demise, another son of Ashurnasirpal, Sin-Sharu-Ishkun, had sought to win the Assyrian throne for himself. Now, with his brother out of the way, he found his position substantially strengthened. But he was not the only contender. In a highly unusual move, Sin-Shumalisha, the chief eunuch, claimed kingship over Assyria as well. Eunuchs, biologically unable to sustain a dynastic line, had never served as king in Assyria before. They were supposed to support the king, not to hold his office. There can be little doubt, therefore, that Sin-Shumalisha's machinations triggered a major crisis of legitimacy for the Assyrian crown. The man who was to take advantage of the infighting between the two competing Assyrian leaders, and in the process changed the course of history, was a Babylonian official by the name of Nabopolassar. Possibly a member of the Chaldean Bidakuri tribe, he was in all likelihood the scion of a family of high-ranking administrators who served on behalf of several Assyrian kings in the city of Uruk in southern Babylonia. Kuduru, Nabopolassar's father, was the governor of Uruk, and Nabopolassar himself must have held some office in the city as well. Both father and son were, in other words, local collaborators with the Assyrian occupation forces, part of the Assyrian intelligence network, and deeply familiar with Assyrian military and administrative practices. After the death of Ashurnasirpal, Kuduru rebelled against his Assyrian overlords, but pro-Assyrian forces defeated him and dragged his corpse through the streets of Uruk. His son, however, having escaped the punitive measures the Assyrians implemented, soon proved a more formidable leader of the liberation movement that had emerged to end Assyria's rule over Babylonia once and for all. By the second month of 626 BCE, with the Assyrians unable to intervene, Nabopolassar was recognized as king in Uruk. At about the same time, he made a first attempt to also establish his rule in the city of Babylon. He initially failed to hold the city. Within a few months, his troops were pushed back by an Assyrian counteroffensive. But the Assyrian forces, engaged both at Uruk and at Babylon, soon found themselves stretched dangerously thin. Attacked on two fronts, they suffered a series of humiliating defeats. Nabopolassar returned to Babylon and, as the Babylonian Chronicle reports, on the 26th day of the month of Arsumna the 8th, ascended the throne there. His coronation is described in some detail in the Nabopolassar epic. He received the crown, a royal seal, and other symbols of power in a ceremony that included a group of Babylonian noblemen joyfully addressing their new ruler with the words, "O Lord, O King, may you live forever. May you conquer, the land of your enemies, to avenge Babylonia." Avenging Babylonia was indeed what Nabopolassar, over the next years, strove for with all his heart. He meant for Assyria to pay the ultimate price for the many humiliating defeats it had inflicted on its southern neighbor over the previous decades and centuries. One of the first victims of Nabopolassar's wrath, it seems, would be Sin-Shumalisha. The Nabopolassar epic reports that the king encountered the almighty chief eunuch, presumably Sin-Shumalisha himself, on the roof of a palace in the city of Kufr near Babylon, where the eunuch at some point late in 626 BCE had attempted to find refuge. The cornered leader beseeched him, "Do not kill me, mighty king." But Nabopolassar was unmoved by his enemy's desperate appeal for mercy. He sounded the order, "Let the Assyrian be killed." With the death of Sin-Shumulishir, Ashurbanipal's son, Sin-Sharu-Ishkun became the sole holder of the Assyrian throne. He would rule Assyria until 612 BCE. Almost instantly, he tried to win back control over the south. The years between 625 and 620 were punctuated by a series of brutal battles in Babylonia, with Babylonian cities, especially Uruk, repeatedly changing sides and sieges getting underway in different places. In a repeat of former conflicts 25 years earlier, during the war between Ashurbanipal and Shamash-Shuma-Ulkin, the statues of important gods were removed from their home sanctuaries, by the Babylonians to Babylon, and by the Assyrians to Arafur. And civilians suffered enormous hardship. The disruptions must have led repeatedly to breakdowns of the social order. Many legal and economic texts from this period include notes that the city gate was closed or that there were hostilities in the land. The situation within Assyria itself was not consistently stable either. Even though the details are murky, it seems that Sin-Sharu-Ishkun had to beat back another internal rebellion in 623. After 6 years, Nabopolassar managed to drive the Assyrians out of Babylonia. Again, details about what happened or how are not available, but the date formulas of Babylonian documents suggest that both Nippur and Uruk were under Nabopolassar's permanent control by 620. A stalemate between the two sides followed, with the Babylonians slowly taking charge of contested territories in the eastern Tigris region. During the year 616 BCE, the hostilities between Sin-Sharu-Ishkun and Nabopolassar were concentrated on the middle Euphrates region, where the Babylonian king scored another victory over Assyrian troops, now reinforced by Iranian allies from the land of Mania. But his westward move stirred up the Egyptians, who had taken control of vast areas west of the Euphrates during the waning years of Ashurbanipal's reign. Egypt was ruled at this time by Pharaoh Psamtik I, whom Ashurbanipal had appointed decades ago. Perhaps Psamtik still harbored some sympathy for the empire on the Tigris, his one-time benefactor. Or maybe he just thought that Nabopolassar posed a greater threat to Egypt's new territorial ambitions in the Levant than the Assyrians under Sin-Sharu-Ishkun. At any rate, he interfered on behalf of the Assyrian king and drove Nabopolassar back to Babylonia. It was a move that turned the Assyro-Babylonian War irrevocably into an international conflict. Nabopolassar, sensing that a major confrontation with Egyptian forces would be unwise at this point, decided to refocus his attention on the eastern Tigris region. Toward the end of 616, he defeated an Assyrian battalion near the city of Arafur. The next year, emboldened by this success, Babylonian troops marched along the Tigris up to Ashur, Assyria's old religious capital. But they were pushed back and had to retreat as far south as Takratan, modern Tikrit in central Iraq. The Assyrian counteroffensive, however, did not get very far either. Attempts by Sin-Sharu-Ishkun's troops to dislodge the Babylonians from their stronghold at Takratan proved unsuccessful, and the Assyrians had to return home again. By mid-615, Assyria's political and military situation was challenging but not yet desperate. There had been earlier occasions when Assyrian troops had been ousted from Babylonia, and unsuccessful Babylonian and Elamite attacks on the Assyrian heartland had taken place even in the not-so-distant past. In none of these instances had the integrity of the Assyrian Empire been in serious peril. Even better, Sin-Sharu-Ishkun could count on support from the powerful kingdom of Egypt. But in the fall of 615, a new outside force joined the fray, the Medes, and with their arrival on the battlefield, Assyria's very existence was suddenly at stake. First attested in inscriptions from the reign of Shalmaneser III from the 9th century BCE, the Medes were a group of initially half-nomadic but increasingly sedentary Iranian tribes, inhabiting the central regions of the Zagros Mountains around Ecbatana, modern Hamadan in western Iran. The Greek historian Herodotus suggests that by as early as 700 BCE, the Medes had established a large empire. But there is no evidence for this in the archaeological record or in cuneiform texts. It was, on the contrary, the political fragmentation of the Medes that made it so hard for the Assyrian kings from Shalmaneser III to Ashurnasirpal to gain full control over them. At the same time, their disunity guaranteed that for more than 200 years, the Medes did not pose a serious military threat to Assyria. But a major change during the last quarter of the 7th century upended Assyria's strategic calculus. A Median chieftain, whom the Babylonian chronicle calls Umakishta, and the Greeks referred to as Kyaxares, managed to bring the different Median tribes together in a kind of confederacy, if not a truly unified state. Although the circumstances that enabled him to do so are murky, it is likely that, along with encounters with other states such as Elam and Delipi, repeated Assyrian attempts to create provinces in the Median territories and enhance trade in the region, especially along the eastbound Great Khorasan Road, contributed to the eventual emergence of a more cohesive Median polity. By facilitating this classic case of secondary state formation, the Assyrians had actually created a monster and dug their own grave. In the Babylonian chronicle, the Medes are first mentioned toward the end of the entry for the year 615, when they went down to Arafur, an Assyrian city and province east of Ashur. Despite a gap in the text, one can confidently assume that they brought death and destruction to the region. A few months later, in the summer of 614, the Medes returned, this time with a greater prize in mind. After passing Nineveh and ravaging the nearby city of Tab-Bisu, they encamped against the city of Ashur, which had been haphazardly reinforced after the failed Babylonian attack the year before. The residents of the city seem not to have expected the worst. Legal and economic documents from the last years and months before Ashur's fall show no signs of the impending crisis. But within weeks, the Medes conquered the city, plundered and devastated it, and, as the Babylonian chronicle expressively puts it, inflicted a terrible defeat upon a great people. Archaeological evidence confirms the textual record. Traces of destruction and of a series of massive fires were found all over the city. Roasted emmet wheat, burned by the flames, was discovered in the Old Palace, the Eastern Palace, and the Anu-Adad Temple. It must have been hoarded in these buildings in great quantities in anticipation of a prolonged Median siege. The skeletons of some of the fallen, including a woman whose head had been severed, were found more cast away than buried, near the street leading from the western Tiberi gate into the city. The loss of Ashur was a disaster for Assyria, not so much because of its military and strategic implications, even though those were significant as well, but for ideological reasons. Since time immemorial, Ashur had been the religious heart of the kingdom, the seat of the Assyrian state god Ashur, and the place where the Assyrian kings were crowned and buried. Now, both the Ashur temple and the royal tombs lay in ruins, and the bones of Assyria's great kings were scattered throughout the city. It must have been a fatal blow for the morale of Assyria's elites and military forces, who had lost their main source of spiritual energy. The Babylonians had arrived too late to participate in the assault on Ashur. The Babylonian king Nabonidus, reigned 555 to 539 BCE, would later characterize the Medes as barbarians, who, much to the dismay of the more civilized Nabopolassar, had no qualms about destroying sanctuaries that should have been spared, and disrupting cults that should have been left unmolested. But if Nabopolassar ever actually had such scruples, they did not prevent him from happily collaborating with the warriors from the east. As the Babylonian chronicle reports, he and Kyaxares met each other near the city of Ashur and came to an agreement. The goal of this fateful alliance is not spelled out, but seems obvious. Together the two kings wanted to seize the Assyrian capital, Nineveh, and sound the death knell on the Assyrian Empire. The final attack on Nineveh took place in 612 BCE. In the preceding year, when he had sent his troops back to the Middle Euphrates region, Sinsharu-Ishkun had shown for a last time that he had not yet completely lost the ability to take the initiative. But he had failed to achieve any lasting success with this operation, and so he found himself in 612, from the month of Simanu III onward, cooped up in his palace on the citadel mound of Nineveh. From there he could watch, undoubtedly with ever-increasing alarm and despair, the combined forces of the Babylonians and the Medes, probably strengthened by troops from Elam and the Arabian Peninsula, encamped against the city. Hundreds of years later, Babylonian scribes studied a number of cuneiform letters that Nabopolassar and Sin-Sharu-Ishkun had allegedly exchanged during the last days of Nineveh. The authenticity of this correspondence is in dispute, but that similar or nearly identical letters are sent back and forth during the time of the siege of Nineveh is quite possible. Nabopolassar writes scornfully to his Assyrian counterpart, "You have been hostile to Babylon. You filled the lands with disorder. You inflicted defeat on the people of Babylon. You introduced crime, guilt, and sin. You fostered evil. You fermented rebellion in the land. You failed to create peace. I shall avenge Babylon. I shall pile up the debris of the wall of Nineveh, which is made of strong stone, like a mound of sand. I shall uproot the seed of Sennacherib, son of Sargon, the offspring of a house slave, conqueror of Babylon, plunderer of the land of Babylonia. Because of the evil deeds that you committed against the land of Babylonia, Marduk the great lord and the other great gods shall call you to account." Sin-Sharu-Ishkun, whose situation was desperate, could only plead for mercy. He addresses Nabopolassar as a mighty king who achieves everything he desires, identifies himself as his servant, and admits his own faults. "I did not perform my duties to the king, my lord." But if he had hoped that his submissiveness would give him a last chance to find a diplomatic way out of his predicament, he was fooling himself. The time for negotiations was long past. Late in the summer of 612, the enemy troops finally broke through the Assyrian defenses. They entered Nineveh, plundered it, killed thousands of its residents, and deported most of the others. Sin-Sharu-Ishkun perished in the course of the attack, though a gap in the Babylonian chronicle leaves us in the dark about the exact circumstances of his death. The devastation of Nineveh followed a carefully devised plan. Before the temples and palaces of the city were burned down, they were not only stripped of valuable objects, but the victorious enemies also systematically disfigured many of the ubiquitous images of Assyrian kings, destroying in particular their eyes, mouths, ears, and noses. This was all very similar to what had happened 34 years earlier during Ashurnasirpal's sack of Susa, when the Assyrian troops, in the course of their rampage, chanced upon an image of Halushu and Shushanak, the Edomite king responsible for the death of Sennacherib's son Ashur-nadin-shumi in 693. Ashurnasirpal claimed to have cut off its nose, which had sneered, sliced off its lips, which had spoken insolence, and broken off its hands, which held a bow to fight against Assyria. Now, the images of Sennacherib and Ashurnasirpal were subjected to comparable symbolic acts of posthumous killing, and there is indirect evidence that Elamite soldiers participated in the desecration as well. The old Assyrian capital Karla likewise fell prey to a brutal attack. Since written sources do not mention the fall of the city, it remains unknown whether it occurred in 614 or in 612, and who exactly was responsible for it. But the archaeological evidence is again unmistakable. Traces of intense fire and ash deposits in many public buildings testify to the extent of the destruction. Copies of the succession treaty that Esarhaddon had concluded with Median chieftains in 672 BCE were found broken in hundreds of pieces on the floor of the Temple of Narbu, on the citadel of Karla, where the Median conquerors of Karla had probably deliberately smashed them, in order to avenge their ancestors' humiliating submission. A particularly grim find was made when Iraqi archaeologists excavated a well located in a courtyard in the southeastern part of Ashurnasirpal II's northwest palace. It was filled with at least 180 skeletons of mostly able-bodied young men, aged 18 to 30, many with iron fetters around their feet and hands. The conquerors must have thrown them into the well while they were still alive. After the conquest of Nineveh, Nabopolassar sent some of his troops westward, where they plundered Nisibis, and deported parts of the population of the Assyrian province of Rusapa. In regions farther north, the war continued as well. Assyrian resistance in the provincial capital of Pushan, modern Ziggurats in Turkey's Diyarbakir province, seems to have lasted until 611. Recent excavations there have produced a cuneiform letter most likely written during this very year. It paints a vivid picture of the hopeless situation in which the city found itself. The sender, a certain Manu Kilabali, probably the governor of Tushan, addresses the treasurer of Assyria, a high-ranking official in charge of the Assyrian border march on the eastern bank of the Tigris in the Turkish-Iraqi border region, writing, "Concerning the horses, Assyrian and Aramean scribes, cohort commanders, officials, coppersmiths, blacksmiths, those who clean the tools and equipment, carpenters, bowmakers, arrow makers, weavers, tailors, and repairers. To whom should I turn? Not one of them is there. How can I command? Death will come out of it. No one will escape. ? I am done." The letter, probably never dispatched, is a cry of despair. Manu Kilabali lacked the means to continue the fight against the Babylonian and Median troops. And so, death did come out of it. Archaeological evidence indicates that Tushan was captured and destroyed, most likely just days after the governor had drafted his last letter, and then largely abandoned. As in other Assyrian cities, its residents and the unfortunate Manu Kilabali must have been either killed or carried away as prisoners of war. Even after the fall of Tushan, the fight for Assyria's survival was not entirely over. In a shadowy historical coda, an Assyrian prince who called himself Ashurnasirpal II made a last attempt to restore the Assyrian state and the royal dynasty. As the Babylonian Chronicle reports, he had ascended the throne in Haran to rule as king of Assyria in an unknown month late in 612. Haran, the city of the moon god, was located on the Balik River and lay so far out in the west that the Babylonians and Medes had not yet attacked it. The throne name adopted by the new ruler, Ashurnasirpal, conveyed two messages. On the one hand, its meaning, the god Ashur has kept alive, expressed hope for an eventual Assyrian revival. On the other, the name harked back to Ashurnasirpal I, reigned 1363 to 1328 BCE. The first Assyrian ruler to assume the title king, Charu, and the one who had been instrumental in transforming Ashur into a territorial state. When Ashurnasirpal II chose this founder figure as his role model, he must have been fully aware that the challenges ahead of him were just as great as, or possibly greater, than those his eponymous ancestor had once successfully faced. For a couple of years, people in the territories along the Kabura and Balik rivers, and in the Taurus foothills, the only Assyrian areas not yet conquered, seem to have acknowledged Ashurnasirpal II as their ruler, although without assigning to him the title king. Because he could not be properly crowned in Ashur as tradition required, Ashurnasirpal seems instead to have been called Crown Prince, literally, son of the king, which suggests incidentally that Sinsharu-Ishkun was his father. In 610, an army of Babylonian and Median soldiers under the leadership of Nabopolassar marched westward to deal with the remaining Assyrian resistance once and for all. In the meantime, Ashurnasirpal had managed to again secure the support of the Egyptians, who had already helped Sinsharu-Ishkun. But when the news of Nabopolassar's impending attack reached Haran, Ashurnasirpal and the Egyptian army were overcome by fear, as the Babylonian Chronicle reports. They abandoned the city and crossed the Euphrates, leaving the territories east of the river to the mercy of the Babylonians and Medes. Nabopolassar captured Haran and took a great amount of plunder in the city and the temple. In the following year, the Chronicle tells us, Ashurnasirpal returned once more to the Haran region. At his side were Egyptian troops led by a new pharaoh, Necho II. On their way, they had defeated and killed the Judean king Josiah in a battle fought at Megiddo. Ashurnasirpal seems to have scored an initial victory at Haran, but then his advance stalled. This is the last time we hear from him. What exactly happened to him remains unknown, but after 609 he disappeared from the scene. Babylonian troops, no longer constrained by the threat of Assyrian counterattacks, were now able to march as far as Urartu. Egyptian army units continued to fight against them for a few more years, but in 605, Nabopolassar's son and Crown Prince Nebuchadnezzar II, most famous as the conqueror of Jerusalem, inflicted two crushing defeats on the Egyptians, one at Carchemish on the Euphrates and one at Hamath in Syria. With Ashurnasirpal's disappearance and Egypt's exit from the Levant, a new imperial power had been established in Western Asia. The torch had been passed from Assyria to Babylonia. Assyrian cities on the Khabar River seem to have been spared the massive destruction suffered by the urban centers in the Assyrian heartland, and Assyrian scribal traditions continued a little longer in this area. The latest documents in the Assyrian language and script from Dur-Katlimu are from 603 and 600 BCE. They are dated with reference to the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II, which shows that Dur-Katlimu's residents fully acknowledged Babylonian rule by the turn of the 7th to the 6th century. Another recently discovered text in Assyrian style, a document about the sale of several fields and orchards in the vicinity of the city of Elhina, probably came from about the same time. It was found farther north, in a field near Hasankeyf, in the Turupdin region in southeastern Turkey. The text is quite fascinatingly dated to the 9th year of Labarsi, the chief cupbearer, while Ubakistiri was the Median king. Ubakistiri can only be the Median ruler Kiexares, called Umakishta by the Babylonians. It seems as if, in the wake of the Assyrian breakdown, the chief cupbearer, Labasi, one of the highest officials of the Assyrian state, had carved out for himself a little fiefdom in a remote and hilly area not easy to conquer. He formally recognized the Medes as his overlords, but probably didn't have to cope with too much interference from them. The scribe of the Hasankeyf document, named in its penultimate line, was a certain Kisir Ashur, from the city of Ashur. He could be identical with a well-known exorcist of the Ashur temple who wrote many of the more than 1,000 medical, magical and other texts that were excavated in 1908 in his family home in Ashur. Either shortly before or after the Median attack on the city in 614, he may have managed to flee and join Labasi and his supporters in their lair. Labasi's little mountain realm remained a relatively inconsequential breakaway fiefdom, albeit one that would deserve to be covered one day in a historical novel. When and how exactly it ended we do not know, through which means the Medes ruled over the northern and eastern parts of Assyria that became part of their sphere of influence, if they ever actually implemented some form of organized government at all, remains obscure as well. Most likely the Median Confederacy slowly disintegrated. Despite protestations to the contrary in later Greek sources, a Median empire seems never to have come into being. The events of the years between 627 and 605 BCE can be described as nothing less than a First World War. They were marked by a series of major revolts, battles, and sieges, led to massive casualties among the civilian populations of several Babylonian, Assyrian, and Levantine cities, and caused the death of large numbers of soldiers. They brought about the deportation of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people, and the complete destruction of Assyria's major urban centers. Initially limited to two powers, Assyria and Babylonia, the confrontation morphed over time into an international conflict on a scale never seen before. The Iranian Manians went into battle on the side of the Assyrians, and the Iranian Medes on the side of the Babylonians. Elamites and possibly also Arabs took part in some of the fighting as well, helping Nabopolassar, while with Egypt another great power joined the fray in support of Sinsharo-Ishkun and Ashur-uballit II. Judah became involved when it sought to stop the Egyptians from re-establishing their hegemony in the Levant, from Suhu and Carchemish on the Euphrates to Urartu in eastern Anatolia. There were numerous additional theaters of war. After the hostilities had drawn to a close, stories of the conflict entered the cultural memory of several ancient civilizations. Assyria's fall was vividly remembered in Babylonia, not only through chronicles, letters, and historical epics, but also in the Hebrew Bible and in the historical writings of ancient Greece and Rome. Everywhere, the war was perceived as a paradigmatic event, a morality tale on the perils of political hubris. Within barely 2 decades, Assyria, an imperial state of unprecedented influence and wealth, had suffered a collapse that was, in its scope, unprecedented as well. Even though a few features of Assyrian civilization survived, what was lost in the catastrophe was enormous. The Assyrian state ceased to exist. the Assyrian royal line, which had endured for more than a millennium, was abruptly cut off. Assyrian urban life continued only on a most rudimentary scale, and cuneiform writing in the Assyrian heartland came to a complete stop. Assyria's rural hinterland suffered massive depopulation, brought about by killings, deportations, flight, and a breakdown in the maintenance of the elaborate canal system that Sennacherib and other kings had created. Archaeological surveys point to a sharp reduction in the number and size of small settlements in the Assyrian countryside in the period after 612. The suddenness and magnitude of the disaster that befell Assyria at the end of the 7th century BCE has befuddled modern historians, prompting them to look for causes deeper than the vagaries of political decision-making to explain what happened. Some scholars have gone so far as to declare politics a mere epiphenomenon in the unfolding events. Greater forces, they claim, were at work. Two recent theories about Assyria's fall stand out. The first looks to environmental changes as the driver of the empire's collapse. In 2014, the American paleoclimatologist Adam W. Schneider and the Turkish Assyriologist Selamet Ali suggested that Assyria's fall was triggered by a severe drought that set in during the mid-7th century. The drought, the authors argued, caused a series of famines in the Assyrian heartland, where population numbers had swelled in the previous decades as a consequence of the mass deportations undertaken by Assyria's imperial kings. This crisis, in turn, allowed the Babylonians and Medes to overrun Assyria and conquer its main cities. A detailed 2019 study by the American geologist Ashish Sinha and other scholars has tried to substantiate this theory by using a more elaborate set of paleoclimatic data. The data was retrieved by tracking the ratios of oxygen and uranium isotopes in two limestone stalagmites, so-called speleothems, from the Kunabar cave, located near the city of Sulaymaniyah in Iraqi Kurdistan, some 300 kilometers, 186 miles, southeast of Nineveh. Similar to ice cores or tree rings, speleothems provide information on a year-to-year basis about the amount of rainfall during the time of their formation. The Kunabar data revealed that the period between 850 and 740 BCE, termed by the authors the Assyrian megapluvial, was one of the wettest times in the history of ancient Assyria. Pluvial conditions had started even earlier, around 925, and lasted until 725 BCE. The authors correlate the environmental circumstances of this time, a blessing for Assyria's agrarian productivity, with one of the most prominent phases of the Assyrian imperial expansion. The Assyrian megapluvial was followed by a long phase of diminishing precipitation, which culminated in a 125-year period of peak aridity between 675 and 550 BCE, dubbed by the authors the Assyrian megadrought. During this time, Assyria's agrarian economy contracted, with eventually catastrophic consequences for the empire's ability to withstand attacks by foreign powers. The loss of Babylonia in 620 BCE was a particularly disastrous blow, because the irrigation-based farming practices of the south were less affected by the drought than the rain-fed agriculture of Assyria and other regions of Western Asia. Nabopolassar was able to rely on harvests that continued to be bountiful, an enormous strategic advantage in his fight against the Assyrians. The continuing drought conditions in the north, the authors claim, would also explain why most Assyrian cities and many rural settlements were not resettled in the decades after 612. The second theory focuses on a different crisis to explain the fall of Assyria, an alleged invasion of mounted warriors of Scythian extraction. The German Egyptologist Karl Janssen Wilhelm has claimed that this event had a major impact on the fate of Assyria. His suggestion is based on a passage in Herodotus's Histories, in which the Greek historian describes the Scythians raiding Syro-Palestine. Herodotus says they had an encounter with the Egyptian pharaoh Psamtik I, who kept them away from Egypt by paying a large ransom, and that they ruled the region for 28 years. Because Herodotus is the only source for this Scythian intermezzo, many scholars have considered the report unreliable. Janssen Wilhelm argues that such doubts are unfounded, and compares the Scythian raid, a real event in his view, to other similar ones, such as when hosts of horsemen, seemingly coming out of nowhere under the Turco-Mongol leader Timur, conquered vast stretches of territory during the 14th century CE in practically no time. Janssen Wilhelm postulates that the Scythian invasion of the Levant took place around 640 BCE, which would mean that the Scythians cut right through the Assyrian provinces in Syria and on the eastern Mediterranean. Later, after they withdrew again, Egyptian troops would have filled the void. Such a course of events would have stripped Assyria of its western possessions, and severely weakened the empire, so much so, according to Janssen Wilhelm, that the kingdom was to become easy prey for the Babylonians and Medes. In Janssen Wilhelm's view, the territorial losses Assyria experienced during the last years of Ashurnasirpal's reign might also have triggered the internal conflicts between different contenders for the Assyrian throne. In weighing whether environmental factors or raids by foreign invaders led to Assyria's collapse, the cuneiform sources provide little help. It should also be noted that the two explanations are not mutually exclusive. On the contrary, climate change leading to greater aridity in Western Asia could have prompted the Scythian migrations. Still, it is difficult to gauge the plausibility of the climate hypothesis and the idea of a barbarian invasion by mounted warriors. Right at the outset, it might be wise to recall that monocausal explanations of Assyria's fall are somewhat suspicious. A theory that explains everything explains nothing, as Karl Popper quipped. That said, the idea that climate change can impact history is of course intrinsically plausible, and while Sinha's 2019 climate study may suffer to some extent from the fact that its data comes from the Mesopotamian periphery rather than the Assyrian heartland, and from margins of error generally contained in isotope data, the information culled from the Cunabar cave seems to be corroborated by proxy data from other locations. Sinha and his co-authors claim that Assyria's agriculture profited from pluvial conditions for some 200 years, from 925 to 725 BCE. During this period, especially its beginnings, Assyria experienced an impressive political and economic rise, and it is indeed tempting to posit a causal nexus between these two phenomena. But correlating the drier phase that apparently began in around 740, when the Assyrian megapluvial came to an end, with Assyria's downfall, is more problematic. After all, an Assyrian empire in the true sense only came into existence with the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III, reigned 744 to 727 BCE. In other words, Assyria entered the phase of its greatest power at exactly the time when climate conditions became not more favorable but less so. The 100 years from 740 to 640, when rainfall was increasingly sparse, were the time of Assyria's greatest geographic extent. One could therefore argue that the Assyrians adapted to the dry conditions, starting around 740, by expanding their borders to acquire grain and other goods from elsewhere. The epidemics that ravaged Assyria in the mid-8th century may have contributed to this somewhat paradoxical development as well. With the loss of its westernmost territories, perhaps as early as 640, and of Babylonia in around 620, Assyria might still have suffered substantially from the decline in precipitation that the new studies postulate for the empire's final decades. But the degree to which Assyria's heartland was affected by more arid conditions is actually hard to gauge. Legal documents from Assyrian cities suggest that Assyria experienced considerable economic hardship during the years 643 or 641 and 638 or 636 BCE. The same applies to 624, 623, and 612 in Gazuna. But for many other years of the final decades of the Assyrian Empire, the written evidence indicates that the economic situation was actually quite normal. In 622, for example, grain prices were down again, and one could hypothesize that the higher prices of the two preceding years were a consequence of internal and external strife rather than drought. Besides, as already mentioned, the citizens of Ashur seem to have done business as usual during the city's last years, and the authorities were able to store huge amounts of grain in various buildings in Ashur prior to its conquest by the Medes. In various locations in the city, the roasted remains of these cereal supplies were found piled up about 1 meter, 3 feet, high. The latest excavator of Ashur, Peter Miglis, has argued that they would have sufficed to feed the whole population of Ashur, estimated by him at 11,000, plus some 8,000 soldiers, for at least a month, and probably much longer. None of this points to a situation in which changes in precipitation would have caused a major agrarian crisis in Assyria. As for the scenario of a Scythian invasion, the main problem is that only Herodotus speaks of it. It is true, as emphasized by Janssen Vilkown, that the cuneiform documentation for the history of the years from 640 to 627 is very limited. But the complete lack of references to a Scythian raid of massive proportions is nonetheless hard to explain. A mid-1st millennium BCE pseudo-historical Babylonian text mentioning a campaign against Ashur, the Sutians, and the Scythians by Shulgiv-Erd, a Babylonian ruler of the 21st century BCE, could be interpreted as an encrypted allusion to Nabopolassar's War of Liberation, and a hint that the Scythians played a certain role in it, but this is speculation. That Assyria lost its western territories to the Scythians is not impossible, but remains highly conjectural. The more conventional explanations for Assyria's fall looked at political factors. One argument that has been made is that the Assyrian Empire could not be maintained without constant expansion. Therefore, when during Ashurbanipal's reign the military and administrative costs for further conquests became too great, the kingdom was doomed. But this idea of diminishing returns is not completely persuasive either. Empires that cease to grow are not inexorably bound to implode. One only needs to remember how long Rome lasted after it had reached its greatest extent under Trajan in the early 2nd century CE. This brings us back from structural and systemic considerations to more contingent factors. Even though it has become somewhat unfashionable among serious historians to emphasize the impact that specific individuals and their decisions can have on the course of history, it cannot be denied that in a state like Assyria, where the king was the linchpin of the whole political machine, failures of particular rulers can sometimes have drastic consequences. And some of the Assyrian rulers of the 7th century BCE, it seems, made major mistakes. There are, for example, the purges that Esarhaddon, worried about possible conspiracies, inflicted on the military and civilian apparatus of his kingdom. Ashurbanipal further sidelined this highly competent elite when he showered his courtiers and palace eunuchs with favors, while giving state officials the cold shoulder. In the 630s, recall that he appointed his chief singer, Gulutu, as eponym, an act that brings to mind the apocryphal story of Caligula making a horse a consul in the Roman Senate. Ashurbanipal's successors seem to have put their trust in a similar cadre of palace staff, individuals without much experience in foreign policy and military leadership. Among the eponyms of the time after 631 are several chief eunuchs, 2 palace scribes, a palace overseer, a chamberlain, and even the king's chief cook, a certain Sailu, who served as eponym of the year 620. As reflected in the Greek Sardanapalus tradition of later times, the Assyrian kings from Ashurbanipal onwards seem to have spent their time mostly in their palaces rather than on campaigns, where they would have met army officers and administrators, and received a more realistic impression of the affairs of the state. Especially Ashurbanipal's transformation from populist to recluse must have hampered decision-making processes in the empire, damaged the reputation the Assyrian kings enjoyed among their leading officials and their subjects, and reduced the fear enemies felt toward Assyrian rulers. It was unfortunate from an Assyrian point of view that this leadership crisis, which reached its peak with the short-lived rule of the eunuch Sin-Shumul-Ishir, occurred at exactly the time when a number of major challenges affected the empire in short succession. The loss of the western territories in the Levant, whether prompted by a Scythian invasion or some other cause, the Babylonian rebellion under Nabopolassar, and finally the sudden rise of a formidable new military power, the Medes. Both Nabopolassar, a one-time Assyrian official in Uruk, and the Medes, united through Assyrian attempts to turn the central Zagros region into a governable political entity, were in a somewhat paradoxical way Assyrian creations. Supplied with a good sense of how the Assyrians thought and operated, they were particularly dangerous adversaries. Even though hardly the main reason for Assyria's sudden collapse, it is possible that a climate-induced drought exacerbated Assyria's woes. A lack of cohesion among the people who lived all over the Assyrian state might have weakened Assyria's political immune system even further. An empire without mission, except for the accumulation of power and wealth, Assyria had never been particularly good at creating something akin to an Assyrian identity beyond its core territories. Apart from order and stability and an artistic language that extolled Assyria's unlimited authority, it had little symbolic capital to offer to the citizens it ruled. Those citizens, in turn, had little reason to support their Assyrian overlords when the latter suddenly found themselves under fatal military pressure. All in all, Assyria between the 630s and 609 was ravaged by a perfect storm. It was the combination of several factors, both internal and external, that brought about Assyria's collapse. That afterward no attempt was made to resurrect the Assyrian state probably had a lot to do with the central role played by Assyria's royal dynasty. Assyrian kings were on the one hand political leaders, but in contrast to their Babylonian counterparts who had no sacerdotal functions, they were, on the other, also high priests of the god Ashur. Without its kings, Assyria ceased to exist, not only as a secular polity, but also as a religious idea, a symbolic order. Not everything, however, was gone. Figuratively speaking, Assyria might have been blown into thousands of pieces, but many of the pieces were still there. Certain aspects of Assyrian culture endured, especially in the city of Ashur, where Assyrian statehood had once originated. The political apparatus of the Assyrian Empire had vanished after the catastrophe of 612. But although shaken, bruised, and fragmented, an Assyrian identity lived on. Afterlife. 15. Assyria's legacy on the ground. In the late summer of 401 BCE, the Greek general Xenophon and his army of 10,000 men found themselves stranded deep in central Mesopotamia. They had come on a mission to support the Persian prince Cyrus the Younger in his fight for the throne. But after Cyrus died in battle at Cunaxa near Babylon, that mission came to an abrupt end. With the victorious Persian king, Artaxerxes II, close on their heels, the Greek mercenaries had to get out of danger and back home as quickly as possible. They were ultimately successful. Their trek ended at the Black Sea, where the troops, relishing their escape, famously exclaimed, "Talata, Talata, the sea, the sea." What is most interesting, though, is what the soldiers from the far west experienced along the way. As they moved upstream along the eastern bank of the Tigris, they crossed the lands that only 250 years earlier had been the bustling heart of the Assyrian Empire. Xenophon mentions 3 settlements that he and his men passed in this region. First, they saw across the river on its western bank a large and prosperous city named Kainai, from which the barbarians brought over loaves, cheeses, and wine, crossing upon rafts made of skins. Then, a little farther northward, there was a large deserted city. Its name was Larissa, reports Xenophon, and it was inhabited in ancient times by the Medes. Its wall was 25 feet in breadth and 100 in height, and the whole circuit of the wall was 2 parasangs, 11 to 12 kilometers or about 7 miles. Nearby this city was a pyramid of stone, and upon this pyramid were many barbarians who had fled away from the neighboring villages. From Larissa, Xenophon continues, they marched 1 stage, 6 parasangs, to a great stronghold, deserted and lying in ruins. The name of this city was Mespila, and it was once inhabited by the Medes. The foundation of the wall was made of polished stone full of shells, and it was 50 feet in breadth and 50 in height. Upon this foundation was built a wall of brick, 50 feet in breadth and 100 in height. And the circuit of the wall was 6 parasangs, 33 to 36 kilometers or 20 to 22 miles. The settlements Xenophon and his soldiers glimpsed on their northbound journey were, in all likelihood, Ashur, Karla, and Nineveh. Ashur, which Xenophon called Kainai, was full of citizens and supplies, and had apparently recovered from the Median attack of 614. Karla, in contrast referred to as Larissa, is described as deserted, even though Xenophon saw many people on top of a pyramid, most likely the ziggurat dedicated to Karla's patron god Ninurta, where local residents took refuge when they saw the Greeks approaching from the south. Nineveh, Mespila, too, is said to have been in ruins and uninhabited. Xenophon is unaware that the three cities had once been famous centers of the Assyrian Empire, and most remarkably, he uses names for them that have nothing to do with the ancient ones local citizens had proudly used during Assyrian times. Xenophon's march through the Assyrian heartland some 200 years after the empire's fall reveals the sheer scale of the region's dramatic decline and transformation. All traces of an Assyrian identity, whether in terms of political structures or with regard to the names of cities, appear to have been wiped out. Yet at the same time, Xenophon's account should not be taken as definitive. After all, he did not visit the region out of an ethnographic interest. He had to pass it as fast as he could to lead his troops out of harm's way. Xenophon did not cross the Tigris to explore Kainai, that is, Ashur, in person, and he did not stop to inspect what was going on behind the long high walls of Larissa and Mespila, the names he uses for Karla and Nineveh. To be sure, if Xenophon had toured these cities more extensively, he would indeed have found a lot of debris, but he would also have seen signs of life within the ruins, and he would have come across elements of a continuing Assyrian culture. Nineveh's ancient name was actually never forgotten. It survived and remained attached to the site down to modern times. As for Karla, even centuries after its fall, the area around the city was still called Kelekene. There are archaeological traces of some resettlement at both places from the decades after their destruction, although on a scale so modest that modern scholars refer to it as squatter occupation. At Nineveh, repairs were made in particular to the Narbu and Ishtar temples in the southwest palace, at Karla to the Narbu temple in the northwest palace. The Assyrian heartland continued to have names such as Athura, Assyria, or Assurestan for centuries, all harkening back to the ancient name Ashur, and the Greek term Syria applied to the formerly Assyrian territories farther west in the Levant ultimately derives from Ashur as well. Though much is taken, much abides, one could say with Lord Tennyson. Given such signs of continuity, post-imperial is a more apt term than post-Assyrian for the period that followed the collapse of the Assyrian Empire. This was no empty land, and the fall of the empire was no end of history. Still, our knowledge of the region during the period in question, especially up to the Parthian conquests in the 2nd century BCE, is woefully sketchy. This is to a significant extent due to changes in local writing practices. Cuneiform clay tablets are almost indestructible, which explains why tens of thousands of them are available from the last 150 years of the Assyrian kingdom. Leather and papyrus, in contrast, which after 600 BCE must have replaced clay tablets as the main writing materials in the Middle Tigris region, are perishable and do not survive in the climate of northern Iraq. As a consequence, we have very few written sources from this area from the 6 centuries following the fall of Assyria. And since the excavators of many Assyrian sites focused on the exploration of the imperial layers while often discarding the post-imperial ones, the available archaeological evidence is likewise limited. For all these reasons, much of Assyria's post-imperial history has to be pieced together with the help of references and texts from Babylonia, Persia, and the Mediterranean world, which are often biased or for other reasons unreliable. And yet some glimpses into the shattered world of what had previously been the mighty Assyrian Empire are possible through this glass darkly. The most telling evidence for a continuation of Assyrian life, not only in the economic but also in the cultural sphere, has been found in Ashur. As hinted at by Xenophon, Assyria's religious center was not abandoned after the Median attack of 614. A clay tablet from the Babylonian city of Separ, most likely dated to 559 BCE, mentions a Babylonian governor of Ashur who had dedicated a slave as a gift to the temple of the sun god of Separ. Clearly, Ashur and the region around it had become a well-administered part of the newly formed Babylonian Empire. The massive Ashur temple, Assyria's former spiritual center, continued to lie in ruins during this time. But at some point, immediately above the debris of its southern enclosure wall, a new sanctuary was erected. Known today as Temple A, a designation assigned to it by its excavators, it was much smaller than the old Ashur temple, but with its thick walls, 18 by 19 meters, 60 by 62 feet long, and a new enclosure wall separating it from its surroundings. the building was nonetheless imposing. The most remarkable feature of Temple A is that it was, quite literally, built out of and upon the historical records of the fallen Assyrian kingdom. More than 100 Assyrian royal inscriptions, ranging from the reign of Ereshkigal I in the early 2nd millennium down to Assyria's last king, Sinsharu-ishkun, were found inserted into the pavement, placed inside the walls, or reused as door sockets within the temple. They might have been retrieved from the ruins of a nearby old temple library that had served as a repository of Assyrian historical texts. Within their new context, as part of the fabric of Temple A, the often fragmentary texts were no longer meant to be carefully studied and read. But everyone who entered the temple would have known that he or she was standing on and surrounded by the written legacy of the world's first empire. Without knowing the date of Temple A's erection or the god to whom it was dedicated, it is hard to interpret this strange and exceptional setting. One possibility is that Temple A was built within a generation or so of the destruction of the Ashur temple by remnants of the local population. They might have wished to provide the god Ashur with a new home and try to draw new confidence from physical encounters with the written records of their glorious past. A slightly different scenario holds that Temple A was erected by members of an Assyrian community that had survived the time of the Babylonian Empire in exile in the southern Mesopotamian city of Uruk, where cuneiform documents attest to their presence. Munich Assyriologist Karen Ratner has contended that when the Persian ruler Cyrus II seized power in Babylon in 539 BCE and founded the Persian Empire, these Assyrians had been allowed to return to Ashur. Indeed, Cyrus claims in an inscription on a clay cylinder from Babylon that he had brought the images of the gods back to their sanctuaries to Ashur, Susar, Akkad, Eshnuna, Zamban, Metilran, Dur, as far as the border of Gutium, and that the people who had been deported from these cities, as well as their descendants, were allowed to go home as well. As the Hebrew Bible famously reports, Cyrus's generosity had also included the Jews, who received permission from him to return to Judah from their exile in Babylonia and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, which previously had been ravaged by Nebuchadnezzar II. Radner posits that something quite similar happened at Ashur. Upon their return from Babylonia in the late 6th century, the Assyrians built a second temple in their old religious capital, from which they had been driven away some 70 years earlier. This temple, Radner believes, Temple A, can be seen as the missing link between some of Ashur's ancient religious traditions and their continuation well into Parthian times. Not every scholar agrees with the idea of Temple A as a post-imperial sanctuary of the god Ashur. During the later Parthian period, between the 1st and 3rd centuries CE, Temple A was replaced by a new temple that was apparently dedicated to Heracles, the Greek equivalent of the Babylonian warrior god Ashurnasirpal. Based on this history of the site, it has been argued that the earlier Temple A might actually have been a temple of Ashurnasirpal II, built not by local residents but by Ashur's new Babylonian overlords, who had taken control of the city shortly after 614 BCE. The purpose of this temple would have been to marginalize the god Ashur and give another deity center stage in the Celtic topography of the city. The integration of Assyrian royal inscriptions into the fabric of the building would have been an act of humiliation. Rather than drawing strength from them, people entering the temple would have trampled on these texts to symbolically reenact Assyria's devastating defeat. Without further evidence or new archaeological findings, it is impossible to decide which of these theories is correct. But the similarities between the religious practices of the Parthian period and those of Neo-Assyrian times can only be explained if one assumes that the cult of Ashur was not interrupted for too long. It therefore seems more likely that Temple A served as a post-imperial sanctuary in honor of the god Ashur, rather than as a monument of anti-Assyrian hatred put up by the Babylonian conquerors. Farther to the west of Ashur, several other important Assyrian urban centers continued to be settled after the fall of the empire as well. Among them was the city of Dur-Katlumu on the lower Khabur, which was now under Babylonian jurisdiction. Dur-Katlumu's rural hinterland was not entirely abandoned either. According to archaeological surveys, some 36% of the Assyrian sites in the lower Khabur area were still inhabited in the post-imperial period, even though on a reduced scale. Especially sites close to the river survived, while those farther away in the steppe were often given up. probably because their agrarian yields were so modest that they were no longer competitive once they had lost their consumer base with the fall of Assyria's great cities. During the early years of Nebuchadnezzar II, the formerly Assyrian town of Gazana in northeastern Syria became the seat of another Babylonian governor. Harran, the last Assyrian stronghold, was apparently not completely destroyed either, even though it must have suffered major damage during the battles of 610 BCE. The Babylonian king Nabonidus reigned 555 to 539 BCE, whose mother hailed from Harran, restored the city's famous temple of the moon god Sin. In nearby Edessa, later capital of the kingdom of Azrini, Assyrian religious traditions survived deep into the Common Era. Even in some places beyond the Euphrates, the legacy of Assyria lived on. A prominent example is the city of Napigi, where Shalmaneser III had settled substantial numbers of Assyrians. Later renamed Hierapolis, the Holy City, the town is described in Lucian's Greek treatise on the Syrian goddess from the 2nd century CE as a place where the deeds of the legendary Assyrian rulers Semiramis and Sardanapalus were faithfully remembered. In the Assyrian East, the city of Arbela, less devastated by the wars of the late 7th century than Assyria's urban centers on the Tigris, remained yet another important bastion of Assyrian culture. Because Arbela, modern Erbil in Iraqi Kurdistan, has always been inhabited and is a bustling modern city today, extensive archaeological excavations at the site are virtually impossible to carry out, but written evidence from elsewhere demonstrates the city's continued prominence after the fall of the Assyrian Empire. For a while, it seems to have served as a regional stronghold under Median control, and it kept this function after the creation of the Persian Empire. In his famous inscription from Bisitun, the Persian king Darius I claims that in the summer of 521 BCE, he impaled his Sagartian opponent Tritantachmes, a member of the Median royal family, in Arbela. Officials from Arbela and from a few other towns in the eastern Tigris region are mentioned in an Aramaic letter from Egypt from the late 5th century BCE. The letter talks about the travels of an Egyptian estate manager by the name of Naktor in the area on behalf of his Persian master. He visited the region at about the time when Xenophon and his 10,000 men passed the ruins of Karla and Nineveh. During this period, Arbela must have been an important regional center in the Persian satrapy of Athora, a province mentioned in Persian inscriptions from Bisitun, Nakshi-e Rustam, and Susa. Persian reliefs show people from Athora delivering cattle and textiles at the Persian court. Of course, the political and economic significance of the formerly Assyrian territories under Persian rule should not be overstated. In 331 BCE, Arbela served as a base for the Persian king Darius III, who set out from there to meet the army of Alexander the Great and hinder its advance. Pitching east against west, the Battle of Gorgamela, probably Tel Gomel in eastern Assyria, took place on October 1 and ended with a decisive victory for Alexander. It ushered in a period of Hellenistic rule over large parts of Asia and was a turning point in world history. But while on earlier occasions Assyrians had been the driving force behind such decisive moments, all that Assyria now had to contribute was the setting for the event. The people on the Middle Tigris were no longer actors on the stage of history. They had become mere spectators. It is likely that the territories in the triangle between Arshout, Nineveh, and Arbela, sparsely populated during the time of the Babylonian and Persian empires, experienced some revitalization when the Greek Seleucids established themselves as the new rulers of Mesopotamia in the wake of Alexander's conquests. The most significant evidence for the presence of Greeks in the region comes, however, from the post-Seleucid period, when a new dynasty, the Iranian Parthians, had assumed power. The Parthians had conquered Mesopotamia in the second half of the 2nd century BCE and ruled it for nearly 400 years, but with government structures less centralized than under the preceding empires. At Nineveh, the Parthians granted a colony of mostly Greek-speaking residents, probably established in Seleucid times, the right to govern itself more or less autonomously. A Greek inscription on a column from Nineveh, most likely from 32 or 31 BCE, mentions a certain Epiphanes and reveals that he served as military commander, strategos, and superintendent, epistates, of the city. A 1st or 2nd century CE limestone statue of Heracles found at the site of Sennacherib's southwest palace bears another Greek inscription that identifies someone named Diogenes as its sculptor. The statue is of high quality and fashioned in classical style. A Greek graffito referring to the same or another Diogenes was found on a beautiful Neo-Assyrian relief showing a huntsman from Ashurnasirpal's North Palace at Nineveh. Since it is hard to imagine that palace reliefs created more than half a millennium earlier were still freely accessible during Greco-Parthian times, it has been suggested that the undoubtedly intrigued Diogenes had come across the slab when driving a drain into the tell during construction work. Assyria's former core territory was split up into several semi-independent vassal kingdoms in Parthian times. Osretni, the kingdom of Edessa near Haran, which became Roman in 165 to 166 CE, lay in the west. The kingdom of Adiabene, centered on Arbela and stretching westward as far as Nineveh, was in control of Assyria's former heartland in the east. In fact, according to Pliny the Elder, Adiabene was nothing but a new name for Assyria. The caravan city of Hatra, located some 50 kilometers, 30 miles west of Ashur, served as an important trading hub and the center of a newly emerging kingdom of the Arabs. It included several substantial temple buildings in Parthian style, such as a massive sanctuary dedicated to the old sun god Shamash, Hatra's patron deity. Finally, there was the city of Ashur itself. During the first 3 centuries of the Common Era, it re-emerged as a semi-autonomous regional center of considerable prosperity and importance. Parthian Ashur, which might have been called Labana from Assyrian Libi Ali, inner city, was in certain respects quite different from the Neo-Assyrian town of the 7th century BCE. The new Parthian-style palace, for instance, probably the residence of a series of local governors, was erected in the southern area of the city, rather than on the site of the old palace on the city's northern edge. But especially in the cultural and religious spheres, there were also some remarkable continuities. Quite a few key deities from Assyria's imperial period, most notably Ashur and his wife Shirua, but also Ishtar, Nanai, Bel, Nabu, and Nergal, were worshipped in Parthian times as well. A new temple of Ashur, now called Asor, was built on a grand scale on top of the rubble of the god's old temple, which had been torn down in 614 BCE. And several Parthian period stone stelae of local governors, who bore the Aramaic title Maria, Lord, are highly reminiscent of similar monuments from the time of the Assyrian kingdom. A particularly well-preserved example is a stela from perhaps 112 or 113 CE, inscribed in the name of a certain Ruth Asor, Aramaic for pleasure of Ashur. It has the same rounded top that characterizes the stelae of Neo-Assyrian rulers and depicts its patron in an act of worshipping symbols of the sun and the moon in an image that looks as though it could have been copied directly from a Neo-Assyrian model. The only difference is that Ruth Asor wears a Parthian-style trouser suit, rather than the traditional dress of a Neo-Assyrian king. The personal names of many of the residents of Parthian Ashur represent another area of continuity. To be sure, the number of Aramaic, Iranian, Greek, and Arabic names had significantly increased in the meantime. But a lot of people still bore Assyro-Akkadian names virtually identical with those that had been used in the 7th century BCE. We find a governor of Ashur by the name of Nubadian, which means Nabu is judge, Akib Ashur, command of Ashur, and even an Ashur-Hetan, that is, Ashur-Ahu-Idina, the name of the great Assyrian king Esarhaddon. Not only names survived the fall of Assyria in the 7th century BCE, other elements of the Neo-Assyrian language did so as well, as indicated by a noticeable lexical heritage in dialects of Aramaic that were in use in northern Mesopotamia. The most astonishing Neo-Assyrian legacy in Parthian Ashur, however, is the continued observance of certain religious holidays. Inscriptions scratched into pavement slabs within the precinct of the new Parthian Ashur temple provide, besides the names of the worshippers who had come to pay homage to Ashur and Shirua, the dates when they visited the temple. These dates overlap in striking ways with the time frames of 2 important religious festivals from Assyria's imperial period. The New Year or Akitu festival, which was celebrated during the first 12 days of the month of Nisanu the 1st, and a series of rituals related to the Deus of Destinies that were performed between the 20th and the 26th day of the month of Shabbatu, the 11th. The lasting importance of Ashur's Akitu festival is also indicated by the fact that during Parthian times, a new sanctuary was built on top of the ruins of Sennacherib's old Akitu house, located northwest of the city wall. These continuities notwithstanding, there is also an important difference between the religious celebrations of the imperial period and those of Parthian times. The former were state events. They involved the Assyrian king, the clergy, and members of the Assyrian elite. During the Parthian period, in contrast, it was ordinary citizens who came to the temple of Ashur to pray to the god and receive divine support from him for their daily lives. A steep hierarchy built into Assyria's imperial religion had apparently been replaced by more democratic forms of worship. Ashur's renaissance as an important religious center in northern Mesopotamia was not to last. In 224 CE, an Iranian warrior by the name of Ardashir defeated the last Parthian king, Artabanus IV. In 226, he was crowned in the Parthian capital Ctesiphon as the first ruler of the new Sasanian Empire, named after his ancestor Sasan. 2 years later, Ardashir attacked Hartra, one of the last Parthian strongholds, conquered Ashur and demolished the temple of its main god. A second attack on Ashur under Ardashir's successor, Shepar I, in 257 CE was the final blow. Some 850 years after its first destruction by the Medes, the city of Ashur ceased to exist, and the cult of Ashur's eponymous god was finally relegated to the dustbin of history. During the early centuries of the Common Era, northern Mesopotamia had seen the newly emerging monotheistic creeds of Judaism, Christianity, and, during Sasanian times, Zoroastrianism, slowly sideline the old pagan cults. In the 1st century CE, the rulers of Ariabani, the New Assyria, had converted to Judaism. As reported by the Jewish historian Josephus, Queen Helena of Ariabani moved to Jerusalem, where she supplied residents suffering from a famine with food and generously supported the Jewish temple. Soon thereafter, Christianity took hold in Ariabani. According to the so-called teachings of the 12 Apostles, a text from the late 1st or the 2nd century CE, the region received its earliest instruction in Christian doctrine from Aggai, a disciple of Addai the Apostle. Arbela became an important early center of Eastern Christianity and served from the 2nd century CE onward as a bishopric. Strikingly, the rise of Christianity in the region did not mean that the old Assyrian religion was entirely wiped out. The Syriac Acts of Persian Martyrs report that a certain Atilaha, who was allegedly killed by Zoroastrian zealots in the mid-4th century CE, had been a priest of Sharbel, the Lady of Arbela. Prior to his conversion to Christianity, this Sharbel can only be the old Assyrian goddess Ishtar of Arbela, the divine patroness of the city, and a deity once worshipped with particular zeal by the great Assyrian king Ashurnasirpal. With the church slowly taking root in Ariabani, priests and clerics deliberately suppressed some of the customs persisting from Assyria's imperial period. But at the same time, church authorities integrated memories of the Assyrian kings and their deeds into the newly emerging stories and legends they were promoting, undoubtedly with the goal of creating a Christian identity in the region that was compatible with its local traditions. The aforementioned Acts of Persian Martyrs claim, for example, that one of the most populous saints of the Eastern Church, Mar Benim, and his sister, Sarah, had been children of the Assyrian king Sennacherib. After a Christian ascetic and refugee by the name of Mati, i.e. Matthew, healed Sarah from leprosy, according to the story, both she and her brother converted to Christianity. Sennacherib, appalled that his children would no longer sacrifice to the pagan gods, had them both killed. But when he too fell ill shortly thereafter, and required the ministrations of Mati himself, he had to acknowledge the power of Christ and ask the ascetic to baptize him. The story is a rather daring attempt to merge historical figures and events that, by conventional chronological calculations, were separated from one another by more than a millennium. But it did not fail to make a deep impression on the people of the region. Another Christian legend with a decidedly Assyrian bent is found in the Syriac History of Mar Quadar, probably written in the early 7th century CE but set some 300 years earlier, at a time when the Sasanian ruler Shapur II, 309 to 379 CE, persecuting and killing many Christians in his realm. Karda, the protagonist of the story, is said to have been from a great people and from the stock of the kingdom of the Assyrians. His father was descended from the illustrious lineage of the house of Nimrod, and his mother from the illustrious lineage of the house of Sennacherib. Initially, Karda is the powerful viceroy of all the lands from the Diyala River in eastern Iraq to the city of Nisibis in the west. Shapur had appointed him to the position in recognition of his enthusiasm for Zoroastrian doctrine, and because of the physical prowess he had displayed when playing polo. At Melki, a site in the vicinity of Arbela, Karda builds a fortress and a fire temple and celebrates a great pagan festival. But when a saint named Abdisho convinces him of the truth of the gospel, Karda converts to Christianity and burns down all the fire temples in his territory. He dies as a martyr at the hands of Persian troops, stoned to death at the gate of his fortress at Melki, which over time becomes a place dedicated to keeping his memory alive. What makes this story particularly fascinating is the fact that Melki, Karda's stronghold, is in all likelihood identical with Milkia, a small Neo-Assyrian town near Arbela, where an Akatu house dedicated to the goddess Ishtar of Arbela was located. Both Esarhaddon and Ashurnasirpal had restored this sanctuary during their reigns, and had shown great interest in it. Just like at Ashur, the Akatu house in Milkia, Melki, seems to have remained a site for religious festivities long after the fall of the Assyrian Empire, perhaps in connection with an annual New Year's celebration. The story is thus an illuminating example of how the Christian community of Ariabani sometimes fused scriptural lore with local history and the legacy of ancient Assyrian religious sites. Over the nearly 2 millennia of their presence in the territories once inhabited by the ancient Assyrians, Christians experienced some dramatic changes. For a long time they fared quite well. Under the Sasanians, the emerging Church of the East enjoyed a considerable degree of autonomy. The new rulers, who were often at war with Rome and the emperors of Byzantium, appreciated the Church's opposition to Christian denominations associated with the Western powers. Persecutions and attempts to silence local clerics were relatively rare. With the advent of Islam in the 7th century, this advantageous state of affairs initially did not change. East Syriac Christians, fluent in Greek, Syriac, and soon also in Arabic, played leading roles as translators and scholars in the cultural golden age of early Abbasid Baghdad. But over time, the Christians of northern Iraq, who, as dhimmis, had fewer rights than Muslims, were increasingly marginalized. As the centuries went by and army after army of foreign conquerors marched through the region, their communities dwindled. During Ottoman times, many local Christians took refuge in remote districts such as Tur-Abdin, the Mountain of the Worshippers. In exactly the same area, the Assyrian chief Cupbearer al-Abbasi had once established a last Assyrian stronghold after the fall of the empire in 612 BCE. Up to the 19th century, the Syriac Christians of northern Mesopotamia refrained from using the term Assyrian as a self-designation. But when Western travelers, archaeologists, and missionaries began to emphasize that the Christians they encountered in the region were the descendants of the ancient Assyrians, as Austin Henry Layard put it in his 1849 book, Nineveh and Its Remains, more and more local Christians began to endorse the label. Undoubtedly, one reason for this reorientation was the hope that an association with the powerful Assyrian Empire would improve their standing. Such expectations, however, turned out to be sadly illusory. Caught up between the emerging nationalisms of Turks and Kurds and the imperial interests of the European powers, the Assyrian Christians, as they now called themselves, experienced a period of dreadful pogroms and displacements, rapes and abductions. In the course of the upheavals that brought the Ottoman Empire to its knees, especially during World War I, more than 250,000 Assyrian Christians were killed, and many others forcefully resettled. After the war, attempts to create an independent homeland for the Assyrian Christians were soon aborted, and the nation-states carved out of the carcass of the Ottoman Empire became the arena for new massacres targeting Christian communities. One of them, committed by local tribesmen and Iraqi military troops, took place in 1933 in the Iraqi village of Samere and the surrounding area, and led to the deaths of between 600 and 3,000 Assyrian Christians. Today, the de-Christianization of the Middle East has reached dramatic proportions. During the numerous political crises of the past 4 decades, Many of the remaining Christians have fled the region. Assyrian Christians are now found in greater numbers in Sweden, Germany, Australia, and the United States than in northern Iraq, southeastern Turkey, or northwestern Iran. Most of the people who consider themselves the last descendants of Sargon and Sennacherib, and continue to give their children the names of these and other Assyrian kings, no longer live in their homeland. In their various exiles, however, they seek to preserve their religious and cultural traditions, emphasize their links with Imperial Assyria, and share their heritage with their new environments. A notable example of Assyrian Christians showcasing their history and culture in the West is a large bronze statue of the bookish Assyrian king Ashurnasirpal designed by the Iraqi-born Assyrian Christian Fred Pahad. Dedicated by the Assyrian people to the city of San Francisco, it was erected in front of San Francisco's main library. All that is now left on the ground of ancient Assyria are the massive ruins of the empire's great cities. Sadly, those too, just like the Assyrian Christians, are in danger of eradication, as the events during the rule of Isis in the Assyrian heartland have shown. But ancient Assyria left yet another legacy, one less prone to the ravages of time: the idea of empire. 16. A model empire. While some components of Assyria's culture lived on after the devastating Babylonian and Median attacks of the late 7th century BCE, and some Assyrian cities continued to be inhabited, the Assyrian Empire, it would seem, had come to an irrevocable end by 609 BCE. Mario Liverani, a leading historian of the ancient Near East, argues that the Assyrian Empire vanished into thin air. According to Liverani, the elements of the Assyrian imperial structure that survived the collapse of the empire were few and ephemeral. Or were they? Peter Bedford, a scholar of comparative history and religion, takes a diametrically opposed view. The empire did not end, he writes. Rather, its center shifted from the Upper Tigris south to Babylon, arguably continuing under the Persians, with its center shifting again further east. The truth is surely less categorical when it comes to something as mercurial as empire. When the Assyrians founded their empire, they created a form of government that endured beyond the fall of Nineveh. And in this sense, the Neo-Babylonian and Persian empires that followed the Assyrian one were indeed extensions of Assyrian practices. Yet empire is a shape-shifting phenomenon. When an earlier empire is replaced by a later one, what ensues is usually not only a change of place, but also a qualitative transformation. Adoption of established political structures goes hand in hand with adaptation and with the creation of new components of governance and political ideology. Accordingly, there were both continuities and changes when first the Babylonian and then the Persian Empire became established as successor states of Assyria. In some respects, the two polities followed the precedents set by the Assyrians, while in others, they deviated from them. Subsequent empires did the same with the imperial legacies of their predecessors. But they were all links in a chain that runs from the Assyrians to the modern age. The state, founded by Tiglath-Pileser, reigned 626 to 605 BCE, and consolidated during a long reign by his son and successor, Nebuchadnezzar, reigned 604 to 562 BCE, lasted for some 70 years, and covered a region, at least eventually, that was more or less equal in size to Assyria's dominions around 648 BCE. Known as the Neo-Babylonian or Chaldean Empire, it was centered on Babylon, Mesopotamia's most renowned city. It came to an end in 539 BCE, when the Persian king Cyrus II seized power from the last Babylonian king, Nabonidus. Because of the crucial role it plays in the Bible, the most famous episode in the history of the Neo-Babylonian Empire is its conflict with the Kingdom of Judah. Twice, first in 597, and then again 11 years later, Nebuchadnezzar II achieved what Sennacherib had failed to do. He conquered Jerusalem. When he took the city in 586, he destroyed Jerusalem's temple and deported a large portion of the Judean population to the rivers of Babylon. For all the anti-Assyrian resentment that Assyria's brutal wars had instilled in the hearts and minds of the Babylonian people, the Neo-Babylonian Empire was in many respects deeply indebted to its Assyrian predecessor. It borrowed important elements of the Assyrian imperial toolkit, from forms of imperial control and administrative organization to ideological concepts and their articulation in art. Given the military and political entanglements that had existed during the previous 120 years between Assyria and Babylonia, it is not so surprising that the former provided the blueprint for the newly emerging Neo-Babylonian Empire. Ever since the days when, in 729 BCE, Tiglath-Pileser III had conquered Babylon, members of Assyria's military and civilian elite had held important positions in Babylon and other southern cities. To be sure, unlike elsewhere in their empire, the Assyrians never completely replaced Babylonia's traditional system of governance. Many Babylonian cities retained a significant degree of municipal autonomy, but Assyria's influence was nonetheless strong. What was more, the first ruler of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, Nabopolassar, came from a family of Babylonian officials who had represented the Assyrian crown and were in regular contact with it. At the beginning of his career, Nabopolassar had been an Assyrian appointee himself, which must have given him deep insights into the ways in which the Assyrian Empire operated. Particularly noteworthy is the degree to which the central bureaucracy of Nabopolassar's new empire was rooted in Assyrian models. Though no Babylonian state archives have been found like those discovered at Nineveh, a building inscription on a fragmentary clay prism from the early years of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II provides some important clues to how the Neo-Babylonian state apparatus actually worked. At its end, the text lists all the palace officials, governors, and municipal administrators who had in some way contributed to the construction of Nebuchadnezzar's new palace in Babylon. Remarkably, 14 out of the 17 state officials mentioned in the preserved portions of the text bear titles with Assyrian roots. Some of these titles, for example Mashenu, chief administrator or treasurer, are genuinely Assyrian words, unattested in Babylonia prior to the time of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. The rules that governed communication between the Babylonian king and his subjects, emblematized by an institution known as the royal word, Amatshari, and the recurring administration of loyalty oaths, Arde, by the monarch, had Assyrian origins as well. Babylonian monumental art is, in general, quite different from the art on display in the Assyrian palaces and temples at Karla, Dur-Shadakin, and Nineveh. Neither bas-reliefs with scenes of warfare nor sculptures similar to the bull and lion colossi found in the entrances of royal suites in the Assyrian capitals have been discovered at Babylon or other Babylonian sites. In the western parts of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, however, which took a great deal of effort for the Babylonian armies under Nebuchadnezzar to reconquer, the iconographic language of some rock reliefs is clearly based on earlier Assyrian models. A relief from the reign of Nebuchadnezzar found at Wadi Brisa in northern Lebanon shows the Babylonian king fighting a rampant lion, a motif of central importance in Assyrian imperial art. Such borrowings represent a deliberate attempt on the part of the Neo-Babylonian kings to showcase themselves in faraway places as the legitimate heirs of their Assyrian predecessors. An example of Babylonian rulers mimicking Assyrian models at home, in the center of their power, is the architectural setting of Nebuchadnezzar's North Palace in Babylon. Raised across the city wall like a fortress, the palace recalls similarly positioned royal residences on Assyrian citadel mounds such as Sargon II's palace at Dur-Shadakin. The rectilinear plan that characterizes Babylon's inner city in the 6th century BCE seems likewise more grounded in Assyrian than Babylonian traditions. Again, Dur-Shadakin offers a close parallel. During the years that the Assyrian Empire fell, most of the Assyrians residing in Babylonia were stripped of the authority they had previously exercised, or else simply killed. Assyrians who arrived in the south afterward, whether as prisoners of war or as refugees, were often assigned menial tasks, such as working on temple estates. But at least some of the Assyrians who made their home in Babylonia after 612 BCE seem to have held more prestigious positions. Among them was a group of Assyrian scribes in the city of Babylon. As indicated by archival documents written in Assyrian script from Nebuchadnezzar's South Palace, the latest dated to 599 or 596 BCE, they served as bureaucrats within Babylon's central administration. The text they wrote belonged to a set of tablets that record, inter alia, expenditures of barley, dates, and oil to political hostages, including members of the Judean royal family. A few Assyrian intellectuals seem to have found a new life in Babylonia as well. An undated astrological tablet from Babylon is designated in its subscript as property of Kundu Elia Ukin, which could be a distorted reference to the Belkundi Alair family from Ashur. Members of this family might have escaped to Babylonia shortly before or after the destruction of Ashur in 614 BCE. In the city of Uruk, Nabopolassar's hometown, an Assyrian community that had established itself during the mid-7th century was still around in the second half of the 6th century, well into Persian times. Members of this community are mentioned in administrative texts from Uruk's Ayana temple. They are identifiable by genuinely Assyrian personal names, many of which, such as Ramani Ashur or Hani Ashur Lamor, include the name of Ashur. The Assyrians in Uruk continued to worship their traditional god and to serve him as priests, temple brewers, and butchers in a sanctuary specifically dedicated to him. The Ayana texts render the god's name as An-Shar, a common spelling of Ashur since the early 7th century, but also the name of an ancestor of the sky god Anu. The latter played an increasingly important role in Uruk during the first millennium BCE. In all likelihood, the Assyrian exiles sought to gain approval for their veneration of Ashur by assimilating him to a local deity of some consequence. The leaders and priests of Uruk, in turn, might have found inspiration in the newly imported Assyrian god when they made Anu the primary deity of their city. A religious reform with beginnings in the 5th century BCE that is, in several respects, reminiscent of the conception of a new Yahweh theology at about the same time in Jerusalem. Uruk's Assyrian residents had apparently brought some heirlooms from their native land when they moved to their new home. Among them was a beautiful Middle Assyrian seal depicting a royal hunting scene. An administrative document from 520 BCE found in Uruk's Ayana precinct bears an impression of it. Also discovered at Uruk among the tablets of a learned exorcist active in the late 4th century BCE was an Assyrian commentary on liver divination. As a note on the tablet reveals, it had once belonged to Ashurnasirpal's famous library at Nineveh. Unless the commentary came to Uruk as war booty, it must have found its way to the city through channels similar to those that had brought the seal there. Many learned treatises from Hellenistic Uruk show notable similarities with earlier Assyrian texts, suggesting that in Uruk, Assyrian scholarly traditions discarded everywhere else may have survived the fall of the empire for a few centuries. Despite their reliance on Assyrian precedents, most Neo-Babylonian kings had little to say about the Assyrian Empire, other than castigating it for its mistreatment of Babylon. But even such criticisms are usually vague, and no Assyrian kings are mentioned by name in the royal inscriptions of Nabopolassar, Nebuchadnezzar, or the three rather negligible rulers who succeeded them until 556 BCE. Following earlier Babylonian rather than Assyrian models, the inscriptions of these monarchs are largely silent about political history in general, focusing instead on building projects, temple sacrifice, and the relationship between the kings and the gods. All of this changes at least to some extent with the rule of Nabonidus, the last Neo-Babylonian king. To be sure, Nabonidus too has harsh words for Assyria, disparaging Sennacherib for his attack on Babylon in 689, but in the context of temple rebuilding, his inscriptions mention the achievements of several other Assyrian kings with approval. Nabonidus refers to Ashurnasirpal II, Shalmaneser III, Esarhaddon, Ashurbanipal, and Ashur-etil-ilani by their official title, King of Assyria, and even calls them in two cases my ancestors. Nabonidus showed a particularly keen interest in Ashurbanipal when he commissioned a new statue for the moon god Sin of Haran, a deity he promoted far beyond the call of duty. Nabonidus needed a model for it, because the old statue had been destroyed by the Medes. As described by the king in an inscription from Babylon, he found such a model on a cylinder seal made of valuable jasper, the stone of kingship, upon which Ashurbanipal, the king of Assyria, had an image of Sin conceived, and which he had firmly placed around the neck of the god Sin. This seal, Nabonidus tells his readers, had somehow survived Haran's destruction, and had been brought to Marduk's Esagil temple in Babylon, where he had stumbled on it. crediting Ashurnasirpal with the creation of the correct image of the god whom he worshipped more than any other deity, is a remarkable show of respect on the part of Nabonidus. Other aspects of Nabonidus' self-representation were rooted in Assyrian models as well. On two stelae from Harran, the king is depicted wearing a cloak that resembles the richly decorated ceremonial garment worn on many Assyrian monuments by Neo-Assyrian monarchs. The stelae themselves, with their rounded tops, are shaped just like royal stelae from Assyrian times. The main reason for Nabonidus' infatuation with Assyrian culture and religion, and with Harran in particular, is that the king hailed from this very city himself. His mother, Arugupi, who was born in the 20th year of Ashurnasirpal's reign and apparently reached the mature age of 102, lived in Harran for decades and might have experienced its partial destruction. She remained throughout her life a devoted worshipper of the moon god, the patron deity of the city. It has even been claimed, although without proof, that she was a member of the Assyrian royal family. Nabonidus, who commissioned a long inscription in the name of his mother upon her death, probably spent his childhood in Harran before moving to Babylon. It is a somewhat ironic twist that the last ruler of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which had been founded on the ruins of its Assyrian predecessor, was more Assyrian than any of the other kings who had held the Babylonian throne before him. In many regards, the rulers of the Neo-Babylonian kingdom followed the examples set by the Assyrian Empire. But certain aspects of the way they governed were actually quite different. Beginning with the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III in the 8th century BCE, Assyrian kings had created numerous new provinces to rule their imperial periphery. These provinces, administered on behalf of the crown by local governors and their staff, generated a steady flow of taxes. The specifics of how the Neo-Babylonian Empire ran the regions outside Babylonia proper is still poorly understood. But it is clear that in the years prior to the 580s, the kingdom's periphery, especially in the west, was not as neatly subdivided into provinces as Assyria's outer territories had been in the empire's heyday. During these years, the Babylonian kings mostly limited themselves to the collection of tribute, which they extorted by means of annual military campaigns from largely independent local strongmen, among them the kings of Sidon, Tyre, and Ashdod. About halfway through Nebuchadnezzar's long reign, the Babylonians managed to establish, if not full-fledged provinces, then at least pockets of local presence in the west, which allowed for tighter control. Something akin to provincial structures seems to have been implemented in Upper and Northwest Syria, while elsewhere in the periphery Babylonian temples were granted land that they had to exploit for their own benefit and for the benefit of the crown with the help of local authorities and laborers. All in all, though, the system seems never to have achieved the same level of control that existed under the Assyrian Empire, and at no point were the Babylonians able to extend their rule to Egypt and the territories of the Medes. Closer to home in Babylonia and the near periphery, introducing streamlined structures of governance proved not much easier for the Neo-Babylonian kings. In the cities in central Babylonia, the power of mayors and high priests remained largely uncurbed, while the eastern Tigris region and the south, including the important city of Uruk, stayed under the control of influential magnates and tribal leaders, only loosely linked to the central government in Babylon. This fragmentation of power led on two occasions during the relatively short history of the empire to internal unrest that resulted in dynastic changes. First after the reign of Nebuchadnezzar's son, Amur-Marduk in 560, and then again after Labashi-Marduk's reign in 556 BCE. Despite the enormous efforts the Neo-Babylonian kings put into their building projects, Babylonia's great urban centers never became royal cities, the way the term applies to Karla, Dur-Sharrukin, or Nineveh. Even the urban landscape of Babylon, the greatly expanded capital of the empire, remained dominated by the gigantic complex of the Esagil Temple of Marduk and the adjoining ziggurat, the Tower of Babel, in the center of the city. The royal palaces were tucked away farther to the north, and while the Assyrian kings, having a finger in every pie, were also high priests of Ashur, the Neo-Babylonian rulers, for all the pious chatter of their inscriptions, were never able to assume leading religious ranks. The high priests of Marduk of Babylon continued to be recruited from long-established local families. What this suggests is that the Neo-Babylonian kings were less powerful than their Neo-Assyrian predecessors, and that their empire was, in a sense, less formidable and cohesive. Still, this relative weakness of the central authority had an important upside. It facilitated the endurance of Babylonian municipalities and religious and cultural institutions in the period after the empire's collapse. In contrast to Assyria, where the fall of the monarchy led to an extensive, all-encompassing breakdown, the Babylonian cities and temples survived Nabonidus' surrender to the Persians for more than half a millennium. The Persian Empire, founded by Cyrus II after his victory over Babylonia in 539 BCE, transcended its predecessors in several respects. At the time of its greatest extent, it was about 4 times as large as the Assyrian Empire, covering an area of some 5.5 million square kilometers, about 2.1 million square miles. Holding territory on 3 continents, it stretched into Central Asia and to the borders of India, while at the same time ruling parts of southeastern Europe and northeastern Africa. And with a lifespan of more than 200 years, from 539 to 331 BCE, it lasted longer than the Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian empires combined. Earlier conquerors of Mesopotamia, for example the Amorites and the Kassites in the 2nd millennium BCE, had swiftly adopted the customs and political structures of the old civilizations on the Tigris and the Euphrates, and established their royal courts in the traditional cities of Babylonia. The Persians pursued a different path. With their rise, power shifted eastward to places such as Susa in the Lower Zagros Mountains and Persepolis in Pharos. Even though Babylonia, and to some extent also Assyria, remained areas of great economic significance. The Persian rulers drew on features of both the Neo-Babylonian and Assyrian empires when forming their own, but they also absorbed some traditions inherited from the kingdom of the Medes, conquered by Cyrus in 550 BCE, and especially from the Old Elamite kingdom, located much closer to the Persian homeland in southwestern Iran than the Mesopotamian states. Tellingly, of the more than 15,000 administrative texts on clay tablets from the reign of Darius I found at Persepolis, only about 1,000 are written in Aramaic, and only 1 is composed in Babylonian cuneiform. The vast majority are written in the Elamite language and script, and the Elamite influence on other aspects of Persian culture was similarly significant. As time went by, most of the military and civilian posts of some consequence were assigned by the new rulers to ethnic Persians. But initially, especially in the first years after Cyrus's conquest of Babylon, members of the traditional Babylonian elite held important positions as well, and the Persians adopted a number of features of Babylonia's political, economic, and ideological makeup for their new empire. Even during this early phase, though, the Persian attitude toward the Neo-Babylonian Empire seems to have been an ambivalent one, as is most clearly shown by the so-called Cyrus Cylinder, composed shortly after 539 BCE with a Babylonian audience in mind. This well-known text reveals a lot about the image Cyrus wished to project of himself and of the empire he had founded. On the one hand, the text emphasizes Cyrus's merits as a traditional Babylonian king. It is written in the Babylonian language and script. It is inscribed on a large barrel-shaped clay cylinder, an age-old medium for texts of this type, and it ends with an account of building work done on Babylon's walls. What is more, the text presents Cyrus as a ruler about to restore Babylon's traditional historical role after Nabonidus, an alien and wicked king, had violated the Celtic rules of the city of Marduk through his lunatic preference for the moon god. On the other hand, the Cyrus Cylinder, undoubtedly upon the king's request, also includes elements far less centered on Babylon. It stresses, for example, Cyrus's origin from an Iranian dynasty of Anshan, highlighting his foreignness, and it alludes in various ways to Assyria. Not only does it talk about the king letting the people and the gods of Ashur return to their home city, it also mentions that a foundation deposit of the Assyrian king Ashurnasirpal who had once sacked the city of Babylon, had been found in Babylon's walls. Here we get a first glimpse of the Persians, seeking to portray their empire as a successor state to Assyria rather than Babylonia. The fact that Babylonian scribes were ordered right from the beginning of Persian rule to date documents after Cyrus, king of the lands, using a royal title previously assigned to Babylonia's Assyrian rulers, rather than a traditional Babylonian one, points in the same direction. A closer look at the newly built Persian capitals in Iran reveals in even more striking ways how the Persians struggled when having to choose between Babylonian and Assyrian models for their new empire. One of the most spectacular archaeological finds made there in recent years by an Italian-Iranian team is a monumental gateway located not far from the main terrace of the royal palace at Persepolis. Probably erected during the earliest phase of the Persian Empire, prior to the rule of Darius I, 521 to 486 BCE. The structure resembles in remarkable detail, both in terms of its architecture and its decoration, Nebuchadnezzar's famous Ishtar Gate in Babylon. Its glazed bricks displaying dragons, strident bulls, and cuneiform inscriptions seem to have been made from the same brick molds that were used for the Ishtar Gate, which suggests that the gate in Persepolis was built by workmen from Babylon. The gate is, without question, an architectural homage to Babylon and its religious and cosmological significance. But the Persians soon abandoned the Babylonian traditions they had adopted when they erected the Persepolis Gate. Within a few years, the architects of the great Persian capitals began finding models in other artistic languages, including those of ancient Assyria. In fact, already during the reign of Cyrus, reliefs decorating a stone gateway in Palace S in Pasargadae show a lion demon, a figure wearing a fish cloak, and a bull man, for which the closest parallels are to be found in reliefs from Sennacherib's southwest palace at Nineveh. The artistic style of later buildings of Persepolis and other urban centers of the Persian Empire displays a mix of different elements reflecting Egyptian, Elamite, and Greek styles. But the Assyrian influence remains persistently strong. The monumental bull colossi and the Gate of All Nations at Persepolis, the image of the Persian king killing a rampant lion demon from the same site, and the way many Persian reliefs render the king's hairstyle and beard are very similar to Assyrian models. Persepolis' stone landscape of endless rows of reliefs depicting tribute bearers breathes an Assyrian spirit too. Clearly identifiable examples of Babylonian influence are far less evident. Another famous Persian monument more in line with Assyrian than Babylonian models is Darius I's trilingual inscription on the Bisitum rock. Although one of its three versions, the other two are written in Elamite and Old Persian, is in the Babylonian language and script. The content of the text, with its emphasis on military action and the physical punishment of traitors, is far more reminiscent of Assyrian royal annals than of Babylonian royal inscriptions. The relief that accompanies the Bisiton inscription is one of many Persian artifacts to depict a winged sun disk containing a human torso, probably a representation of the king. This enigmatic symbol of cosmic order has a close Assyrian antecedent as well. It is still unclear whether the Assyrian solar disk represents the god Ashur, the sun god Shamash, or some combination of the two. And the same uncertainty applies to the identification of the disk in Persian imperial art, where it may or may not stand for the Persian state god Ahura Mazda. But the close association of the symbol in both traditions with the figure of the king makes it very likely that one of its main functions was to convey the idea of the ruler as a representative of the main god, and to highlight that the ruler's chief task was to carry out the universal mission of imposing order on the world on behalf of the deity. The Assyrians and Persians, in other words, shared not only the artistic motif of the solar disk, but also elements of the royal ideology behind it. In the course of the nearly 200 years that followed its completion, no Persian ruler apparently ever commissioned another inscription like the one on the Bisiton monument. Cyrus's account of his deeds on the cylinder from Babylon remained the only text of this type as well. The royal messages of later Persian kings focus instead in rather anodyne, de-individualized and abstract fashion on general statements, especially about how the crown helped maintain the cosmic order. Here, Persian imperial ideology markedly deviated from earlier Babylonian and Assyrian models. Still, in other respects, Assyria in particular remained a central reference point for the Persian Empire, not only in the arts, but also in terms of the empire's structure and mode of operation. The well-maintained provincial system of the Assyrian Empire was reborn in Persian times in the form of the roughly 24 satrapies, into which the new state was divided by the time of Darius I, each administered by a governor who had to report directly to the great king. Persian land tenure systems and the empire's royal road had Assyrian antecedents as well. Assyria, it seems, became the Persians' model empire. The 5th century BCE Greek historian Ctesias of Cnidus, who wrote a long history of the Near East after serving for nearly 2 decades as chief physician to the Persian king Artaxerxes II, and healing him from a wound he had suffered in the Battle of Cunaxa, collected numerous stories about Assyria during his time at the Persian court, stories that became part of the historical memory of the West after Ctesias's account had been integrated into later works, such as Diodorus Siculus's Universal History. About the Neo-Babylonian state, in contrast, Ctesias had comparatively little to report. His Persian sources were apparently not very interested in it. The Babylonian priest, Berosus, who wrote another history of the Near East during the early Hellenistic period, sought to rectify Ctesias's account by putting greater emphasis on the role Babylon had played. But his work, although more accurate, was later less extensively studied, and thus the Babylonian Empire was often glossed over in later accounts of global history, whereas Assyria appeared center stage. 2 questions remain to be answered. First, why the Persian rulers, after an initial period marked by a certain degree of respect and appreciation, suddenly became so disillusioned with Babylonia, turning instead to Assyria. And second, how the Persians actually received their knowledge of the history, politics, and art of the Assyrian Empire. After all, the Assyrian state had ceased to exist some 70 years before Cyrus conquered Babylon. Persia's increasing disenchantment with Babylonia had several causes. Lacking a truly universal imperial ideology, the Neo-Babylonian kingdom had probably been a less attractive model for the ambitious Persian rulers from the start. But a series of anti-Persian revolts in Babylonia also played an important role in causing Persia to turn away from Babylonian models. The first of these took place during the politically chaotic phase after the death of Cyrus's son, Cambyses, in 522 BCE. The second a few decades later, in 484, when Babylonians rebelled against the newly appointed Persian king, Xerxes. Xerxes reacted with massive reprisals that ushered in a period of crisis in Babylonia. After these experiences, it does not come as a surprise that the Persian rulers considered the Assyrian kingdom of yore a more attractive paradigm for their new empire than unruly Babylonia. It is still difficult to account for the distinctively Assyrian elements characterizing the Persian Empire, most notably in the realm of the arts. Assyria's great royal cities, Karla, Dur-Sharrukin, and especially Nineveh, all lay in ruins at the time of Cyrus II's rise to power. But Persian artists and craftsmen visited them during the early decades of the Persian Empire to study what was left of the great palaces of Ashurnasirpal II or Sennacherib seems a rather dubious proposition. More likely is that elements of Assyrian art and civilization were transmitted to the Persians by intermediaries, such as the Babylonians, Urartians, Medes, or Elamites. Especially the Median and Elamite kingdoms might have been vectors for Assyrian inputs, as they were close to the Persian homeland. Another place where Persians might have encountered Assyrian art and culture is the Assyrian city of Arbela, which was less affected by the destructions of the late 7th century BCE than other Assyrian cities, and remained an important regional center. It also bears remembering that around 640 BCE, when the Assyrian Empire was still flourishing, Asut-Noruku, a son of Cyrus II's ancestor and namesake Korash I, had spent some time at Ashurnasirpal's court at Nineveh. A member of the dynasty that would eventually produce Cyrus II thus had a front row seat to observe the workings of Assyria's imperial machine. That his experiences at Nineveh had a formative impact on the nascent Persian kingdom is not an unreasonable assumption. Finally, archaeologists have unearthed significant numbers of Assyrian art objects in the so-called treasure at Persepolis. The most impressive example is a beautiful stone bowl with handles in the shape of lions that is inscribed in the name of Ashurnasirpal. Along with other objects, it might have been looted in 614 or 612 BCE by the Medes. If the Medes brought it to their capital, Ecbatana, the Persians might have taken it from there. The Persepolis treasury was ransacked in 330 BCE by the soldiers of Alexander the Great, and it is likely that many even more precious Assyrian artifacts had once been stored there. The images on some of these objects, and on others kept elsewhere, might have served Persian artists as models for the Assyrian-style images and monuments they created, thus bringing about a kind of Assyrian Renaissance. After the collapse of the Persian Empire in 331 BCE, in the wake of Alexander's epoch-making campaign to the east, the Hellenistic Seleucids founded a new empire, which was subsequently replaced by the Iranian empires of the Parthians and Sasanians, and then, after the Islamic conquests, by empires dominated by Arabs. As time went by, the imperial idea also traveled to other parts of the world. To the east, climaxing in the Mauryan and Mughal empires centered in India. To the north, with the Seljuk and Ottoman Empire as prime examples of imperial states in the Turkish world, and to the west as well. Here it was Rome, the greatest empire of the ancient world that outshone everyone else. The conspicuous similarities between Rome and Assyria, whether in terms of their respective provincial systems or with regard to their emphasis on military matters and their cultural indebtedness to earlier, more sophisticated civilizations, are in general not the result of deliberate borrowing. Rather, the two states produced similar answers to comparable political challenges. But there is no question that the Romans observed closely how the Seleucid Empire, Assyria's great-grandchild, operated, and how the Seleucids established an imperial Eurasian system of global proportions. This was a model the Romans were quite keen to emulate. To be sure, Pompey and Caesar and later Augustus and the emperors after him normally took great care to distance themselves from the kings of the East, whether they belonged to the Seleucid Empire or the subsequent Parthian and Sasanian dynasties, and to hide their own autocratic ambitions behind a smokescreen of republican play-acting. But the political structures they created, and eventually in late antiquity, how the Roman emperors increasingly defined their own role, often followed Eastern examples. Rome served as a model for the Byzantine, Frankish, and Germanic empires that succeeded it. Many more recent empires, including the British, the largest of all, can be considered links in the chain of imperial transmission as well. Even today, the idea of empire remains deeply embedded in political discourses, although modern states with imperial ambitions eager to avoid the negative connotations the term has assumed normally no longer advertise themselves as empires. As the imperial torch was passed from one state to the next, Assyria receded more and more into the background. Whatever direct influence the Assyrian Empire might have had on its immediate successor states became a mediated effect, less and less detectable, as both the practice and the idea of empire changed over time. But within the discourse of empire, at least in the West, Assyria never ceased to play a crucial role. Proponents of the medieval doctrine of translatio imperii, the transfer of imperial rule, and their classical forerunners, from the 5th century BCE Greek historian Herodotus to the 4th century CE Roman theologian Orosius, regularly credited the Assyrians with having founded the first empire in world history. The ultimate root of this notion is to be found in the many stories that circulated in the ancient world about the Assyrian Empire and some of its most important kings and queens. And the main repositories preserving these stories to which we now turn are the Bible and the works of classical historians. In these texts, the Assyrians lived on, even if a self-contained Assyrian cultural tradition did not.